It started like any other day, but by the time the sun set, everything had changed. Karen, the dreaded HOA president, went from being an annoyance to an absolute monster. Picture this: my 8-year-old daughter Lily playing outside, completely unaware of a nightmare about to unfold. Suddenly, a sickening scream pierces the air, and I rush outside to find Karen standing over her with a shovel raised high, her face twisted with rage. I couldn't believe my eyes as Karen brought the shovel down on my little girl's skull. Blood. Chaos. My heart stopped. What had driven this woman to hurt an innocent child like this? But the real shock came when my Uncle Joe stepped in, bringing a riot squad to Karen's door. And trust me, it didn't end there. This story is full of twists and secrets that you won't see coming. Keep watching to find out what happens next. Hey there, before we dive into this wild story, let me ask you a quick question. Where are you watching this from? Go ahead, drop your city in the comments. I always love hearing from people all over. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. I've got a feeling you won't want to miss what's coming next. Now, let me take you back to one of the darkest days of my life, the day Karen, the HOA president, took things way too far. I never thought I'd be standing here telling you this story, but it's one that needs to be shared. It all started on a regular Saturday afternoon. I was in the kitchen making snacks for my daughter, Lily, and her friends who were playing outside. Everything seemed normal, peaceful even, but then out of nowhere I hear a scream, a blood-curdling scream. I ran outside, and what I saw still haunts me to this day. There was Karen holding a shovel standing over my daughter. The next few seconds were a blur. My heart dropped as I saw the blood pouring from Lily's head, her face pale with shock. But it doesn't end there. Oh no, not by a long shot. What happened next turned into something even more shocking, something I could never have expected. My Uncle Joe, a former military man with a reputation, stepped in, and when I say he brought a riot squad to Karen's house, I mean it literally. I know you're on the edge of your seat, so don't go anywhere. This isn't just a story about revenge. It's about secrets that could shake this whole neighborhood to its core. So stick around and let's get into it. Trust me, you won't believe the twists that are coming next. The day started like any other. The sky was clear, a perfect shade of blue, and there wasn't a cloud in sight. I had just finished cleaning up after breakfast, a simple task that didn't seem like it would be the last time I'd feel normal for weeks. My daughter, Lily, had just turned 8, and like any child her age, she was full of energy, laughter, and a carefree spirit that made every day feel like an adventure. Lily and her friends were playing in the backyard, the sounds of their laughter spilling into the kitchen as I began preparing some snacks for them. They were running around, playing tag, and chasing each other through the garden, their imaginations running wild. I loved hearing their little voices fill the air, the innocence of it all. I had always been a bit of a worrywart, constantly checking on my daughter to make sure she was okay. It was a reflex, a mother's instinct. But on this day, as I heard them giggling and running around, I thought, maybe I can relax today. I didn't know that those few minutes of peace would be the calm before the storm. I had barely started to grab the fruit and snacks from the counter when the doorbell rang. It was a strange interruption, especially on a weekend. No one ever came by unannounced in this neighborhood. The homes here were all meticulously maintained, and the residents followed a strict set of rules established by the HOA, Homeowners Association, which had a firm grip on everyone's lives. That's when I saw her, Karen. Karen was the HOA president, and to put it mildly, she wasn't the type of person anyone wanted to cross. She had an ironclad grip on the community, micromanaging every little detail from lawn care to the paint on fences. If your grass was an inch too long or the mailbox wasn't aligned just right, she'd be there, knocking on your door with her complaint in hand. But as much as I disliked her, she was just an annoyance to me until that fateful day. She stood on my doorstep with that all-too-familiar fake smile plastered on her face. "Hey, can I talk to you for a minute?" she asked. Her voice was sweet, but I could hear the underlying tension in it. Karen always had that way about her, pretending to be polite, but making it clear that you were going to do things her way. I knew she had some complaint, Probably about the flowers I had planted along the driveway, or maybe the fact that we hadn't trimmed the hedge the exact way she preferred. But I didn't have time for her. My daughter was outside, and I just wanted to make sure she and her friends were okay. Sure, but make it quick, I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. I stepped outside to listen to her complaint, hoping it wouldn't take too long. Karen immediately started rambling about some minor infraction, but my attention was elsewhere. I kept glancing back towards the backyard, where I could still hear the kids playing. Something didn't feel right. Then, without any warning, the sound of Lily's scream cut through the air, sharp and filled with terror. It was a scream I will never forget, a scream that made my blood run cold. Everything stopped. My heart froze in my chest. I turned quickly, my mind racing. My body moved before I could even think about it. "Lily!" I shouted, already sprinting toward the backyard. I left Karen standing there, her voice trailing off as I ran, my legs burning with fear. When I turned the corner of the house, my worst nightmare unfolded in front of me. There she was, Karen, standing over my daughter, who was on the ground, writhing in pain, and in Karen's hand was a shovel that she had just used to hit Lily. The blood was everywhere. The sickening thud of metal against bone echoed in my ears as I stood frozen, my heart racing. For a second, I couldn't process what I was seeing. I couldn't believe it. Karen had just hit my child. Lily was lying on the grass, her hands clutching her head, her face pale, and her body trembling. She was gasping for breath, her eyes wide with fear. I could see the deep gash on her skull, the blood pouring out of it in a steady stream. I wanted to scream, but my voice wouldn't come. I was paralyzed, unable to move, unable to do anything except stare in horror at the scene before me. Karen stood there, holding the shovel like she was proud of what she had just done. She wasn't even shaking. There was no sign of regret in her eyes, only a twisted sense of satisfaction. It was as though she had done something righteous, like she had every right to hurt my daughter. Why? I finally managed to croak. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, as if it belonged to someone else. "Why would you do this to my daughter?" Karen didn't respond. She didn't even flinch at the question. Instead, she looked down at Lily with disdain, like my child was nothing more than an obstacle in her way. "She's been causing trouble," Karen muttered, almost as if explaining a trivial thing. She was breaking the rules. This had to be done. The rules. I couldn't comprehend what she was saying. This wasn't about rules. This wasn't about the HOA or any petty complaint. This was about my daughter, my child, lying on the ground bleeding, in pain because of a person who had no regard for life. I was snapped out of my shock when I saw Lily's eyes starting to close. "No, no, no, no." I screamed inside my head as I rushed to her side. I knelt down beside her, trying to stop the bleeding with my hands. My daughter's blood was all over me, but all I could think of was getting her help, getting her to a hospital, getting her away from that monster. I shouted for someone to call 911, but my voice was barely audible over the chaos in my mind. I couldn't think straight. Was this really happening? Was my daughter really hurt like this, all because Karen, because of some twisted sense of control? The seconds felt like hours as I held Lily, praying for her to stay awake, for her to keep breathing. I couldn't lose her. Not like this. Not to someone like Karen. And that's when Karen did something that made everything worse. She turned and began walking away as if nothing had happened. She didn't try to help. She didn't apologize. She didn't even look back. She simply walked off. That's when the rage hit. But I couldn't focus on that right now. I needed to get my daughter help. I needed to make sure she survived. As the ambulance arrived and the paramedics rushed to take Lily away, I was left standing in the yard, the bloodstains still fresh on the grass. What had just happened? Why had Karen done this? And what was going to happen next? I had no answers, only questions. But I knew one thing for sure, this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The hospital was a blur. The moment the ambulance rushed away with Lily inside, I found myself on autopilot trying to keep it together. My hands were still shaking, covered in her blood. As I stood there, unable to do anything but watch the chaos unfold. The paramedics had assured me they would do everything they could, but it didn't matter. It felt like my world had come to a screeching halt, like I was living in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I stumbled to my car, my mind racing. Was she going to survive? The thought repeated over and over, gnawing at me. But even as I told myself that I should stay calm, the panic inside me kept rising. My daughter was the most precious thing in my life, and now she was in the hands of doctors and nurses, and there was nothing I could do except wait. The drive to the hospital felt like it lasted an eternity. The familiar streets seemed strange, as though I was seeing them for the first time. I couldn't focus on anything except Lily, her face, her screams, the feeling of helplessness that was eating me alive. The blood, the way she had looked up at me with those wide, terrified eyes, it was all I could think about. When I finally arrived, I was ushered into a sterile waiting room. There were other people in the room, patients, families waiting for news, but none of their faces registered in my mind. All I could do was sit there, my hands clenched in my lap, barely able to breathe. Was she going to make it? The hours seemed to stretch on endlessly. Every time the door opened, my heart would jump in my chest, only to sink again when it wasn't the doctor coming to give me an update. My hands were slick with sweat, my body tense and aching from the constant anxiety. Finally, around 2 in the morning, a nurse came in. She was kind, but her face had the kind of solemn expression that told me it wasn't good news. I braced myself. "Mrs. Hayes?" she asked gently. I nodded, my voice lost in my throat. The words didn't want to come. "Your daughter is stable," she said, relief flooding my body at the sound of those words. I didn't even hear the rest of what she said. She could have told me that Lily was miraculously healed, and I wouldn't have cared as much as I did when I heard that one word, stable. My body sagged, the weight of the past few hours finally catching up to me. I was too tired to feel anything but exhaustion, but I still had 1,000 questions. What had happened to her? How bad was the damage? Would she ever be the same? The nurse went on to explain that Lily had suffered a skull fracture, and though they had managed to stabilize her, they still weren't sure about the long-term damage. The doctors were concerned about swelling on the brain and the possibility of a concussion, but they couldn't say for sure until the swelling went down and they could run more tests. She was unconscious, which they said was normal for such an injury, but that didn't stop the fear from consuming me. I thanked the nurse, still not fully able to process everything she had just said. She left, and I was left in the room alone, once again with my thoughts. I had to remind myself that Lily was in good hands. I couldn't lose it now. I had to stay strong. But how could I stay strong when I couldn't even begin to understand what had happened? As I sat there, trying to make sense of everything, my thoughts kept returning to Karen. Why? Why had she done this? It wasn't like Lily had done anything to her. Lily was just a kid, a little girl who loved to play and laugh, who would never hurt anyone. And yet, Karen had swung that shovel like she was punishing a criminal, like my daughter was some sort of enemy that needed to be dealt with. What kind of person does that? I had always known Karen was power-hungry, the kind of person who loved to throw her weight around because of her position in the HOA, but this was beyond anything I had ever imagined. She had crossed a line. No, she had obliterated the line, and there was no going back. I had to know what had driven her to do this. There had to be something, some explanation, some twisted justification that she was holding on to. I couldn't let it go. I couldn't let her get away with it. The next few hours were a haze of hospital updates, family members who arrived to offer support, and nurses coming in and out. I don't even remember much of the time between when Lily was wheeled into her room and when I finally saw her again. All I remember is the overwhelming feeling of dread that clung to me, even in the midst of the good news. When I finally saw Lily, she was lying unconscious on the hospital bed, her small frame hooked up to machines that beeped rhythmically. Her face was swollen, her head bandaged, and I couldn't help but feel like I was staring at a stranger. It was still my daughter, but she didn't look like herself. I couldn't believe how much had changed in just a few hours. I touched her hand, and my heart shattered as I saw the slight twitch of her fingers. She was still there. As the hours dragged on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something was being hidden from me. The doctors were kind, but they were guarded. They spoke in medical terms that I couldn't fully understand, and it seemed like every time I asked a question, they avoided giving me a straight answer. It was almost like they were holding back something from me. I could feel it in my gut. There was more to this than just an accident. And that's when it hit me. Karen wasn't just a woman with a power trip. She was a monster. I had to do something. I couldn't just let this go. The woman had attacked my daughter, and I couldn't rest until she paid for what she had done. I took a deep breath, trying to push past the fear and the anger that were slowly bubbling up inside of me. I had to focus. Lily needed me. I had to stay strong for her, for the little girl who had been robbed of her innocence that day. But as the night wore on, I knew one thing for sure: this was far from over. The days that followed the incident were a blur of hospital visits, phone calls, and endless waves of emotions that I couldn't keep up with. I had no idea how I was supposed to navigate this new reality, one where my daughter was in the hospital and her life hung in the balance. I tried to stay strong, but there were moments when the weight of it all felt too much to bear. Lily was my everything, and I couldn't understand how one person, one act of violence, could completely shatter the peace we once had. The doctors were doing everything they could, but the nature of Lily's injury was serious. Her skull fracture had caused significant swelling in her brain, and they weren't sure if there would be any permanent damage. There were constant tests, scans, and monitoring, each one more nerve-wracking than the last. Every time a nurse came in to check on her, I felt a surge of fear grip my chest, waiting for the worst news to come. Would she wake up? Would she be the same? Would she remember the pain, the terror, the moments before everything went dark? The uncertainty was unbearable. I found myself sitting in the sterile hospital room for hours on end, staring at my daughter's unconscious form, willing her to wake up to tell me she was okay. Her small hand would twitch every now and then, a flicker of life, but it was never enough to calm my racing mind. I wasn't sure how long I could handle the silence. How much longer could I watch her like this? But as difficult as the physical pain was, it was nothing compared to the emotional toll this was taking on me. Every time I looked at Lily, I saw the sweet little girl who had trusted the world around her, and that trust had been violated in the most brutal way. It wasn't just the injury that tore me apart, it was the fact that Karen had done this. Karen, the woman who had made herself the self-appointed ruler of the neighborhood, the one who controlled every tiny detail of our lives through the HOA. But what made her do it? What made her swing that shovel at my daughter, as if Lily's life meant nothing? My mind couldn't reconcile this. Karen had always been abrasive, rude, and self-righteous, but I had never imagined her capable of such violence. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. This wasn't just some outburst. This wasn't a moment of insanity. Karen had planned it. That shovel wasn't an accident. She had swung it at Lily's head with purpose. It wasn't just a random act. It was deliberate, calculated, and cold-blooded. That thought kept me up at night. Why? What had driven her to this? Days passed, and though Lily remained unconscious, she seemed to be improving. Her doctors told me it was still too early to be certain, but they were hopeful that the swelling would go down and that there wouldn't be any long-term brain damage. But that hope didn't do much to ease my fear. It was hard to believe that my daughter would return to the life she had before. The Lily I knew was a sweet, innocent child who loved to play, dance, and dream. What if that Lily never came back? What if she couldn't ever be the same? I spent every moment by her side, watching her for any sign of movement, any sign of life. My world had been turned upside down, and nothing felt real anymore. Karen had taken that away from me, and I couldn't let it go. I couldn't just sit back and wait for justice to be served. I needed answers. I needed to know what had pushed this woman to destroy everything in her path, to hurt my daughter in such a vicious way. It wasn't long before I began to dig into Karen's past. What I found shocked me to my core. Karen had been the HOA president for several years, and it seemed that her grip on the neighborhood had only tightened over time. People in the community were terrified of her, too scared to stand up to her. She made threats, fined people for the smallest infractions, and basically ruled with an iron fist. She controlled the neighborhood with an obsessive need for perfection, and anyone who dared challenge her faced the consequences. But that wasn't the worst part. No, what disturbed me even more was what I learned about her past. It wasn't just about power. It wasn't just about controlling a neighborhood. Karen had a history of violence. Over the years, there had been rumors circulating about her temper, about strange incidents involving her interactions with other residents. But I had always dismissed them. People like her were never the ones you expected to do something so horrific. But when I started piecing things together, a clearer picture began to emerge. Karen had a history of bullying and intimidating neighbors, using her position in the HOA to terrorize anyone she could. But it wasn't just petty squabbles. There were whispers about past assaults, about Karen threatening people with physical violence. It was as if her obsession with control extended far beyond lawn care and neighborhood bylaws. I couldn't believe what I was learning. It was as if I had been living in the same neighborhood as a stranger all along. How had I not seen this? How had I trusted her enough to allow my daughter to play in the same space as her? But what truly shook me was the fact that Lily had never been the real target. Karen's anger wasn't really about the lawn or the complaints or anything else. Lily had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Karen had been enraged by a previous dispute she had had with another neighbor. This neighbor had dared to challenge Karen's authority, and Karen had made it clear that she wasn't going to tolerate that. The more I thought about it, the more I realized Lily's innocent play had become the final straw for Karen. It wasn't just that Karen had taken her frustrations out on Lily. No, she had used Lily as a way to send a message to everyone in the neighborhood. If anyone dared defy her again, this was what would happen. She was a ticking time bomb, and Lily had been the unlucky target of her fury. As the days stretched on, the anger within me grew. This wasn't just about an attack. This was about a broken system that allowed Karen to get away with everything. She had terrorized this community for years, and now my daughter was the one who had paid the price for it. But I wasn't going to let it go. Not this time. I knew I couldn't just sit back and wait for the police or the legal system to handle this. Karen had to pay for what she had done, and I was determined to make sure she did. As I sat by my daughter's side, I vowed to take action. I wouldn't let her get away with hurting my child. This was personal now. The system might have failed us, but I wouldn't let that stop me from getting justice. Karen had picked the wrong family to mess with. It had been days since the attack, and though the initial shock was beginning to wear off, the weight of it still pressed heavily on my chest. Every time I looked at Lily, now awake but disoriented and in pain, my heart broke. She was trying to get back to normal, trying to push through the trauma, but I knew the scars she had would last far longer than any physical injury. The mental damage her trust shattered would take a long time to heal. But even in the midst of all this, I knew something had to be done. Karen needed to pay for what she had done to my daughter. There was no way I could just let it go. I had already begun researching her, piecing together the horrible truth about the kind of person she was, and it made my blood boil. But as much as I wanted to storm over to her house and demand answers, I knew that wasn't the right way to go about it. That's when Uncle Joe stepped in. Joe was, to put it bluntly, a force to be reckoned with. He wasn't just your typical family uncle. He was ex-military, tough, tactical, and with a reputation for handling business when it needed to be handled. Growing up, I had always looked up to him, admired his quiet confidence, and the way he seemed to command respect without saying a word. He had been through countless situations, some of them I never fully understood, and had lived a life that wasn't always conventional. He knew people, and he knew how to make things happen. It didn't take long for word to reach him about what had happened. He wasn't one to sit on the sidelines when it came to family, especially when someone had hurt one of his own. I got the call late one night, a deep, steady voice on the other end of the line. "Hey, kid, I heard about what happened. I'm coming to take care of it." At first, I wasn't sure what he meant. Take care of it? What did that mean? Joe wasn't one for beating around the bush, and I knew he had his own unique way of handling problems. But this was something beyond what I could handle. I wasn't sure what he was planning, but I wasn't about to stop him. The next day, Joe arrived at my house, looking like he always did, calm, collected, and somehow radiating an intensity that put everyone around him on edge. There was no sign of the usual comfort or pleasantries. He came straight to the point. "I've been talking to some people," Joe said, leaning against the kitchen counter. His voice was low and serious, a stark contrast to my own panicked, high-pitched thoughts. "Karen's been running a racket for years, hasn't she?" I nodded, still unsure of what to expect. "Yeah, but how do you know all this?" He smiled grimly. "I've got my sources. You'd be surprised who I know, kid. I'm not the only one who's had enough of her. You're not the first person she's terrorized, but I'm not here to waste time. We're taking action." I didn't know exactly what he meant by taking action, but I wasn't about to question him. Joe had his own way of making people listen, and this was the first time I'd seen him so determined. It was clear that he wasn't just angry, he was calculating. He spent the rest of the afternoon talking to a few of his contacts. He called in some favors, did a little digging, and got in touch with a network of people who were fed up with Karen's control over the neighborhood. By evening, I began to understand what he had in mind. Joe wasn't just going to file a police report or take the matter to court. He was going to bring the fight directly to Karen's doorstep. And when I say fight, I don't just mean a confrontation. I mean bringing in a force of his own. It wasn't long before Joe made the call. The next morning, a convoy of cars arrived at our street. I wasn't sure what to think. The cars were unmarked, no distinguishing features, just a line of vehicles that seemed out of place in our quiet, suburban neighborhood. But when I saw the men stepping out of the cars, I knew that Joe wasn't joking around. The men weren't local. There was something about them that made it clear they weren't just any average individuals. They wore simple black jackets, but their posture, their movement, spoke volumes. They weren't here to play by the rules. They were here to send a message. "Don't worry," Joe said, his voice steady as he looked at me, seeing the confusion in my eyes. "We're going to make sure Karen understands that she's messed with the wrong family. You've got my word." It wasn't long before we all drove over to Karen's house. The street was quiet, the morning sun casting long shadows on the pavement. But it wasn't the usual calm of our suburban street. The arrival of Joe's crew, along with the silence that surrounded the area, made it clear that something big was about to happen. As we pulled up to Karen's house, the atmosphere shifted. People started peeking out from behind curtains, wondering what was going on. I could see the shock in their eyes as they watched Joe and his team approach the front door. It was like something out of a movie, an intimidating but somehow justified scene. I stood a few paces back, watching from the sidewalk as Joe knocked on Karen's door. The knock wasn't soft. It was a firm, deliberate sound, loud enough to rattle anyone inside. And I could hear Karen's voice from the other side, her attempts to hide the fear in her tone. "What do you want?" she asked, trying to sound like the same controlling HOA president I had seen so many times before. Joe's reply was simple. "We need to talk." The door swung open, and that's when the confrontation began. But it wasn't just Joe standing there. His team had positioned themselves strategically around her property. No one was getting in or out without Joe knowing it. Karen was clearly thrown off balance by the sheer presence of these people. She had never been one to back down from a confrontation, but this was different. She realized quickly that she was outmatched. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice trembling ever so slightly, the arrogance in her tone fading. Joe looked her dead in the eyes. "You've been terrorizing this neighborhood for far too long, Karen. But what you did to my niece, it ends now." Karen took a step back, her face paling. She had been caught in a web of her own making, and now she was realizing there was no escape. This wasn't just about fines or complaints anymore. It was personal. "You've hurt the wrong people," Joe continued, his voice like ice. "And now you're going to face the consequences." Karen's face twisted, and for a split second, I saw something I had never seen before: fear. This woman, who had lorded over this neighborhood for so long, was now staring down the very thing she had tried to control for years: accountability. And in that moment, I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't going to be over until Karen understood just how far the damage she had caused had spread. Joe wasn't just here to intimidate, he was here to make sure the entire neighborhood knew exactly who the real monster was. The next steps would be more than just confrontation. They would be the beginning of taking back control. The tension in the air was palpable as Joe stood there, unwavering, facing Karen on her doorstep. The quiet of the suburban street felt surreal, almost like time had slowed, and everything was building to a boiling point. I watched from the sidewalk, my heart hammering in my chest as the situation unfolded in front of me. Karen, the once all-powerful HOA president, stood in the doorway with a look of disbelief on her face. Her eyes flickered from Joe to the men standing behind him. Her facade of control was crumbling. I could see it in the way she shifted uncomfortably, trying to gather her thoughts, trying to regain her usual authority. But it was too late for that. She had crossed a line, and now the consequences were coming for her. "Do you think you can just march up here and intimidate me?" Karen spat, her voice trembling, but she tried her best to sound defiant. "I'll have you all arrested for harassment. This is my property and you—" "Enough," Joe interrupted, his voice steady and commanding. "You don't get to hide behind your authority anymore, Karen. You don't get to bully people and think there won't be any consequences." Her face tightened with frustration, and for a moment I could almost feel sorry for her. She didn't understand the gravity of the situation. Karen had always been the one in control, pulling the strings behind the scenes, using her position as HOA president to manipulate everyone around her. She had made countless people's lives miserable, but now she was facing something entirely different. This wasn't just about a few complaints or fines. This wasn't just about her petty grievances. This was about the violence she had inflicted on my daughter. And Joe was here to make sure she understood that. The men behind Joe didn't make a move, but their mere presence was enough to keep Karen from doing anything rash. They were calm, collected, but there was an undeniable power in their demeanor. They weren't just there to intimidate. They were there to protect Joe's interests. Karen had no idea who she was really dealing with. "You've terrorized this neighborhood for too long, Karen," Joe continued, his voice low and controlled. "You've used fear to get your way, and people have suffered because of it. But not anymore. I'm not here to ask you to change your ways. I'm here to make sure you know there will be consequences for your actions." Karen's expression faltered, the confidence slipping away as she realized the full weight of what Joe was saying. This wasn't just a confrontation over a lawn or a neighbor's complaint. This was a battle for power, and it was one she had already lost. "You don't get to hurt my family and walk away scot-free, Karen," Joe said, his voice now a cold edge of finality. "And I won't let you do it to anyone else." I watched as Karen's face twisted, her eyes darting around, her mind racing. She was trying to find a way out of this, to manipulate her way out of a situation that she had never imagined would be possible. "I have connections," she said, her voice rising slightly. "People in the community will back me up. I'll make sure you regret this." Joe stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. "Let me make one thing clear, Karen, your connections don't mean anything to me. You're dealing with a whole different level here, and I'm not going anywhere until I'm sure you're held accountable for what you did to my niece." Her face paled at the mention of my daughter. Lily's name hung in the air like an unspoken challenge. Karen had thought she could get away with it. She had thought her position, her so-called power, would shield her from any real consequences. But now, standing in front of Joe, she saw that she was wrong. "Do you think you can just scare me into submission?" Karen's voice cracked, the bravado she had relied on fading fast. "I'll fight you. I'll fight everyone. Joe raised a hand, cutting her off. "You don't have to fight anyone, Karen. You've already lost. The only question now is how far you're willing to go to dig yourself deeper." Her eyes flashed with fury, but she wasn't fooling anyone. The fear was there, buried beneath her anger. She realized now that her threats, her manipulations, meant nothing to Joe and his team. The game had changed. Here's the deal, Joe said, his voice cool and calm, but carrying an undeniable authority. You're going to step down from your position as HOA president. You're going to leave the people you've hurt alone, and you're going to leave this neighborhood in peace. If you don't, we'll make sure everyone knows who you really are. And we'll make sure they understand the true cost of your actions. Karen stared at him, her eyes wild with panic. For the first time, I saw something that hadn't been there before, a crack in her armor. Her grip on the neighborhood, on the power she had so carefully cultivated, was slipping away. The realization that she no longer had control over the situation was almost too much for her to process. No, she spat, a last-ditch effort to cling to her former authority. I won't do it. You don't scare me. Joe took another step forward, his presence overwhelming. You should be scared. You've already crossed a line, Karen, and you can't undo that. The only thing left for you is how you handle the consequences. There was a long, tense silence as Karen's mind raced, trying to find an escape, but deep down she knew. She was done. She had no more leverage, no more power. The people who had once feared her were no longer afraid. The very people she had tormented were watching her crumble, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Finally, Karen lowered her gaze, the fight drained from her. Fine, she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. I'll step down. I'll leave. But this isn't over. You'll regret this. Joe nodded, his expression unreadable. It's over for you, Karen. The only question now is whether you're going to walk away quietly or make it harder on yourself. With that, Joe turned and motioned for his team to follow him. The men behind him stayed in position, making sure that no one would try to stop them. As they turned to leave, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief wash over me. Karen stood frozen on her doorstep, defeated. The woman who had once controlled everything in this neighborhood had been brought to her knees by the very people she had tried to crush. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt like my daughter's nightmare was finally over. The fight wasn't over, though. We still had to heal, to rebuild the trust that had been shattered. But for now, Karen had been silenced, and the neighborhood would never be the same. The reign of terror she had held over all of us was officially done. Joe had won, and so had we. The days that followed the showdown at Karen's house were strange. The neighborhood was quieter than it had been in years, the air hanging with an unfamiliar sense of calm. The power that Karen had once wielded so ruthlessly over everyone was gone, and with it, the underlying tension that had been suffocating the community. People were cautiously optimistic, but nobody dared to speak too openly about what had happened. It was like the momentary silence had everyone holding their breath, waiting for something else to happen, waiting for Karen to somehow rise again, as if she could still claw her way back into control. But in those first few days, nothing more came from her. She didn't show her face around the neighborhood. No one saw her making her usual rounds of complaints or looking down on people from her HOA throne. It was as though she had simply disappeared. Joe, as expected, didn't let his guard down. He had made it clear that if Karen ever tried to return or retaliate in any way, we were ready. But even though there was relief, there was something in the air, a nagging sense that this wasn't quite finished. I couldn't shake the feeling that something else was going on. It wasn't until a week later that I got the call. It was late one night when my phone buzzed, its vibration cutting through the stillness of my house. I looked at the screen, not recognizing the number. At first, I thought about ignoring it. After all, we were still in the aftermath of everything that had happened, and I didn't need any more surprises. But something told me I had to pick up. Hello. I answered cautiously, half expecting a telemarketer or a wrong number. But the voice on the other end made my blood run cold. This is Detective Monroe. I'm calling in regard to your situation with Karen. The voice was calm, professional, but there was an undercurrent of something unsettling in his tone. We need to talk. Can you meet me tomorrow at 10 a.m. at the precinct? My heart skipped a beat. The precinct? I couldn't understand why the police would still be involved after everything had seemed resolved. Karen had stepped down. We had taken back control, hadn't we? But something in the detective's voice told me this wasn't just about Karen anymore. The next morning, I arrived at the precinct, my mind racing with a million questions. I tried to push away the feeling of dread that was slowly creeping up my spine as I entered the building. The sterile white walls, the low hum of fluorescent lights above, and the quiet buzz of officers moving about, it all felt so official, so final. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking into something much bigger than I'd imagined. Detective Monroe greeted me with a firm handshake and led me into a small conference room. The door closed behind me with a soft click, and I sat across from him, my nerves on edge. "I know you must be confused," he said, taking a seat across from me. "But I need you to listen carefully. What you thought was the end is only the beginning." I couldn't make sense of his words. "What are you talking about? Karen's gone. She's left the neighborhood. We've all had our fill of her. It's over." The detective leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he studied me. "I'm afraid it's not that simple. Karen's role in this, while significant, is just one piece of a much larger puzzle. You see, Karen wasn't just an HOA president. She was part of something much more dangerous. And her departure? Well, that wasn't as voluntary as you might think." I felt a chill run down my spine as the word sank in. What was he saying? I had always suspected there was something off about Karen, something sinister behind her obsession with control, but I never imagined it could be this serious. Karen's been working with a larger network. Monroe continued, his voice lowering. A group of individuals with influence and resources. People you wouldn't even think twice about. And these people, they've been orchestrating a string of illegal activities in this area for years. Money laundering, fraud, even blackmail. You name it. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. Karen? Involved in something like that? It didn't make sense. She had always been so obsessed with order, with maintaining her tight grip on the neighborhood. How could she be part of something so corrupt? Karen's position as HOA president, Monroe explained, gave her the perfect cover. People trusted her. She used that trust to manipulate residents, to exploit them for her group's benefit. All those complaints she issued, they weren't just about weeds and fences. They were part of a larger scheme to control people, get leverage over them. She used her power to get them to either comply with her demands or, well, you know what happened to the ones who didn't. I sat there in stunned silence, the weight of his words slowly sinking in. The entire neighborhood had been manipulated, but worse, people had been coerced into committing crimes or becoming involved in something they never could have imagined. After you confronted her, the detective said, Karen thought she could back down and walk away. But what she didn't realize is that her group isn't willing to let go of their operations so easily. They've been monitoring the situation, and now that Karen's gone, they'll try to rebuild their control either by placing someone else in power or by taking more drastic measures. I shook my head, trying to process everything he was saying. So this isn't over? The threats, the manipulation, it's all still going on? Monroe leaned forward, his face serious. Yes, and unfortunately, the group Karen was working with is far more dangerous than she ever was. They're involved in much bigger operations, and they won't hesitate to do whatever it takes to stay in control. I felt the blood drain from my face. This was more than just a neighborhood problem. This wasn't just a matter of getting Karen out of the picture. There was an entire network out there, operating in the shadows, with much more power and influence than I could have ever imagined. And they weren't going to let me or anyone else stand in their way. Detective, what do we do? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I felt the fear creep back into my chest. How do we stop them? Monroe paused for a moment, his gaze steady. We don't stop them alone. We have to work together, get ahead of them before they rebuild their operation. But we need more eyes, more information. And most importantly, we need you to stay alert. These people won't give up easily. I nodded, the weight of what I had to do sinking in. This was bigger than I had ever imagined. Karen's actions had been just the surface. The real battle was far more dangerous, far more complex. And now, my family and I were in the thick of it, caught up in a web of deceit and crime that stretched far beyond the confines of our quiet neighborhood. But I wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not after everything we had been through. I would fight for Lily, for the neighborhood, for everyone who had been unknowingly dragged into this mess. And somehow, we were going to bring them down, once and for all. Call to action. This story isn't over, and the fight is far from finished. Karen may have been taken down, but the real threat is still lurking in the shadows. The network of corruption and manipulation is far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. But we're not backing down. We will expose the truth, no matter how deep it goes. You can be part of this fight. If you've been through something similar or know someone who's been affected by the manipulation of powerful people, share your story. We need to stand together. Leave a comment below. Tell us your thoughts, your experiences, and let's make sure the truth is heard. If you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any updates. This fight is bigger than any one person. It's about justice, it's about standing up for what's right, and it's about making sure that no one ever has to go through what my daughter, my family, and this community has been through again. Stay vigilant, stay strong, and together, we'll make sure the people behind this don't get away with it. The battle is far from over, but we're in it together. Let's take a stand.